Protect has been very pleased to work with the Signals Network to produce a Tech Workers Guide to Whistleblowing. But what are the challenges and the opportunities that technology brings for whistleblowers? What does behavioural science tell us about the workers of the future? And what are the expectations of the next generation of workers? Our panel here is chaired by Linklaters Partner Nick Marshall, so I'm going to hand over to them.
Thank you very much. Firstly, thank you all for coming today. Fantastic conference. Linklaters has worked with Protect for a number of years, and we're delighted to be able to host today. So, starting with our panel, they're all sitting out of order, which is slightly confusing. So, to my immediate left is Shantha David, who's Head of Legal Services at Unison. She won the LexisNexis Holsbury Rule of Law Award in 2018, was Liberty's Human Rights Lawyer of 2017, Chair of the Employment Law Committee of the Law Society, and is famous for a number of incredible victories in the Supreme Court and the European Court of Justice, most recently yesterday, I think, in the Agnew holiday pay case. To her left is Clive Robins from Nationwide Building Society. Prior to that, Clive worked for the Competition and Markets Authority, the UK's competition regulator, leading their prescribed person whistleblowing arrangements, but the vast majority of his career was spent in the Royal Military Police, so everyone on their best behaviour today. Christian Hunt is to his left, founder of Human Risk, a behavioural science-led consulting and training firm specialising in ethics and compliance, and the author of Humanising Rules. Christian was formerly Managing Director, Head of Behavioural Science at UBS, and COO of the Prudential Regulation Authority, one of the UK's financial services regulators. To Christian's left is Elle Holland, who qualified with an LLB from the University of Salford earlier this year. Elle went viral on LinkedIn for all the right reasons, posting about her assistance in her mother's unfair dismissal whistleblowing trial, which has since been covered by the Law Society, Gazette and Legal Cheek. And last but not least, Fraser Simpson, who has built and leads the Wellcome Trust ethics, governance and compliance function. Fraser started out as a lawyer here at Linklaters, so welcome home, before shifting his focus to not-for-profits. His work has taken him across the world, including time spent living and working in Tanzania. He's passionate about ensuring that purpose-driven organisations not only do the right thing, but do it in the right way, with a genuine focus on human behaviours. So with that out the way, we'll start actually with Christian. Christian, what does behavioural science tell us about whistleblowers? And what's changed, particularly in the last few years through the pandemic, coming out of the pandemic, in respect of those behaviours and whistleblowing in that context?
So I think it was obvious in the last panel, what we're dealing with here is a psychological problem. And often we approach it as a logistical problem or a logical problem. But it's actually a psychological problem. We're trying to persuade human beings to do something which can be challenging for them. And I think recognising that ultimately the task here is to persuade a human being to come forward helps us to understand what we're dealing with. And I think one of the things to recognise is that humans are complicated. And so on the one hand, we all want to speak up. We have a natural innate thing. We're not very good at keeping secrets. Right? We want to share. We love sharing gossip. So if we come across something, and let's remember that the average person doesn't set out to become a whistleblower. We don't want to put ourselves in a position where we have this dilemma of what do I do. So they've been put in a position by something that they have come across and have to react to that. And so on the one hand, we've got a human reaction that says, I really want to tell someone, I want to get it off my chest, I want to share it. We know that that's how we resolve issues in our minds. We share it with other people to get their views and thoughts. The flip side is there are a ton of reasons why whistleblowing is challenging. There's social pressure. We don't know, and this is where secrecy doesn't help us, we don't know that many people that have whistleblown. So we think it's a strange thing for us to do. And we've heard it in the previous panel, there are a ton of reasons why people might not want to do it. Lots of pressure on you if you think you're the only person doing it. If you're standing up against vested interests, that can be quite tough. And so what we're looking at here is asking people to do something that is very, very difficult, that they are not familiar with. And I'm really struck by thinking through from the perspective of the person going through this process. And you know, the conversation around NDAs I thought was fascinating, because actually, as soon as you mention the word NDA to a non-lawyer, that's suddenly terrifying. That's a territory that they don't recognise. And you know, for what it's worth, I'm a big fan of getting rid of them completely, because I think even the existence of a document, even if it's in your interest, creates a psychological barrier. So we have all these challenges that we need to deal with. So yes, we need the law to support it, very supportive of the last panel, but I think we need to look at the psychology behind it and recognise the challenges that are there. And I think civil aviation is a great example where it happens. And we heard some of the factors that explain why people come forward with whistleblowing. So I think it's a complicated thing, and I think we need to start thinking psychologically as well as logically as to how we get people to do this. What has the pandemic done? Everything and nothing, because we still have the same human OS up here that is driving our decision making. So what has changed is the context. You could look at it positively and say that people spending a little bit of time out of the office might give them a chance to reflect on the realities of life and recognise there are other important things, and they want to be true to their own family values. On the other hand, you could say it takes them out of the office environment, makes it even more terrifying for people to come forward. We've got social trends moving forward where I think people's willingness to speak up, a lot more. Social media, for all its ills, actually encourages transparency, people sharing things. That could be a positive, although social media can also be used to intimidate people and put pressure on them, so potentially negative there. So I think it's a mixed bag. What we have to recognise is that things are changing, and there are going to be some positives coming out of that. I think younger generations are willing to step up. Prime example, sitting on my left, and do things that perhaps some of us might not have felt able to do, but also wouldn't have had the tools to do in the past. So I think it's dangerous to sit there and say that change is all positive. Some of it's moving in a positive direction, some of it moving negative. I think the key bit is to understand it, which brings me back to psychology. Have to recognise the pressures that are on people, and if we do that, we can start to develop solutions that get the outcome we're looking for.
And I think that kind of discussion around tech, social media is certainly something we'll be coming back to later, because I think that's really interesting to see how that's kind of affected the way people speak up and when they're willing to do so. So, Elle, you're a Gen Z, Gen Z lawyer. What's your view of whistleblowing, particularly in the context of the assistance that you gave to your mother through her claim? Do you think your generation is more willing to speak up than potentially your mother's generation?
I think there are a lot more people that
I just wonder whether it would have been.
As a generation, it's more acceptable to have multiple jobs and perhaps even careers, as it were. For my mum's generation, who was very traditional, she worked in the care industry. I think as a generation, we have a lot of priorities for the workplace. I don't think we're as willing to confine ourselves into a box of a toxic workplace, and we're much more likely to speak out in that sense. So like I said, I think there is a mental health priority, and a lot of things that used to be kind of stigmas in the workplace, we kind of taken our stride and are much more happy to prioritise that in the workplace. I think there are a lot of different factors, and it's difficult because I think it depends on what industry you work in and what is kind of at risk. So for my mum, like, there were elderly people that she thought were being abused and perhaps even dying, so she had a lot at risk, so she had to kind of weigh that against her losing her career. But I think for our generation it's much more adaptable to be able to go out and explore finding a new career if it was so toxic in the world we were currently in. But I think there has been a shift in speaking out, and our generation is much perhaps more likely to do so. I think we've heard the horror stories of the workplace and seen so many examples of people speaking out, and we've kind of seen it happen. So I think it's becoming much more of a open thing to do. So yeah.
And Clive, you're nationwide big employer, and you've been heavily involved in the whistleblowing arrangements there. What changes have you seen, I guess, in the workplace more generally, and what behaviours are acceptable and not acceptable, and the willingness of those now coming into the workforce willing to speak up, as opposed to those who maybe wouldn't have spoken up if we were having this discussion 10, 15 years ago?
Yeah, so I've been at Nationwide now for about 4 years, and without doubt, we have seen a steady increase in the amount of concerns about unacceptable behaviour that we see coming through. Do we think they're coming from the Gen Z or the Gen Z cohort? Well, we can't tell, because we don't harvest and capture that data. It wouldn't be appropriate to do that as one of the 9 protected characteristics. But there is definitely less tolerance in the workplace for unacceptable behaviour. And this is borne out a little bit. I've done a little bit of science behind this. My daughter is very much Gen Z, Gen Z. And this is a true story. Last week, she applied for a role at a very high-profile supermarket, high street supermarket. And on Saturday, she was offered the job. And she was telling me over breakfast that she turned it down. And it was double the pay that she was getting in her old part-time job. And when she said she turned it down, I nearly spat my cornflakes out. And I said, well, why have you done that? She said, because I've spoken to my friends, and the culture in the workplace, I've heard, is quite toxic. I said, well, what do you mean by toxic? And she said, well, if you don't get something right, the manager will shout at you. Now, I'm very much from the Gen X cohort. And I spent 32 years in the army. That came as second nature to me. And I said, why have you done that? Because I don't want to work in a place where I'm going to get shouted at. So I think sometimes you have to look at, what does this mean? What does unacceptable mean? And when we get these cases into my team and we put them through the triage process, what I'm asking my team to do is to look at a very subjective phrase in an objective way. What would the person on the top of the Clapham Street omnibus, how would they determine unacceptable behaviour? And I think it's fair to say, and this might be a little bit against the grain or controversial, but absolutely the stuff that we heard earlier from the Me Too ladies, that was absolutely unacceptable behaviour. But if you're talking about toxicity in the workplace and somebody swears, somebody shouts at me in a meeting, is that unacceptable behaviour? Is it? To you, it might be. To others, it might not be. Because you have to consider, if you then launch a whistleblowing investigation into that individual, then their appointment becomes potentially untenable. So it's a really difficult process for us to understand and for us to follow through on, because it's such a subjective phrase. But you're absolutely right, we do see far more allegations being made about unacceptable behaviours in the workplace. Absolutely.
Thanks very much, Clive. And Fraser, you've done a lot of work on ethics in the workplace and ethical behaviour at work. Do you think, or has the balance between climbing the career ladder, I guess, and some of those mental health concerns that Elle mentioned earlier, has that changed, do you think, in the workplace?
Yeah, I think undoubtedly. I think the balance of climbing the career ladder versus an awful lot of considerations have changed, not just mental health. I look at my sort of personal experience, golly, back in March the 6th, 2005, I think it sort of indelibly etched on my mind was my first day working here. I thought I'd have a long and joyful career in one job and emerge a vastly paid law firm partner, and you know, something went wrong somewhere. I think the only person more nervous about that than me is the bank manager. But that sort of career trajectory doesn't happen anymore. People are concerned about stuff. People want to be talking about issues. We've heard a number of these issues around being shouted at, but it's also around sustainability, it's around inclusion, it's around this whole raft of ethical issues. And those ethical issues, you know, some persist over time, they're embedded, but some are pretty dynamic. Things grow in importance and ease off in importance in their focus. But there is this growing acceptance that they're really important. And what we try to do is to recognise they're important, to call that out, but not to stop there. It's to how do you go about living and breathing that? How do you make it clear to your people that actually you're thinking about it? How do you spark conversations around it? How do you normalise and humanise those pieces? And I think a huge part of the ethical piece is giving people the ability to speak up about that, whether that's formally or, really importantly, informally. How do we actually spark conversations about, is it okay? Is swearing at somebody in a meeting okay? Well, are there safe ways that we can actually start to have that conversation that doesn't get into this sort of binary, do nothing, do nothing, do nothing, do nothing, whistleblow, panic, employment relations over, end of the earth, because that's unsustainable. You've got to normalise these sort of situations that we can actually build an ethical organisation that allows those conversations to happen in a constructive way. That means we don't get to that conversation we just had before of resolution reintegration into a completely broken relationship. Ooh, let's not have the broken relationship in the first place. Let's just normalise the hard conversations, the courageous conversations.
And Shantha, coming to you, it's not just, I guess, a new generation coming through, but it's also new technology, social media, it's been alluded to already, makes it much more easy to blow the whistle, particularly publicly, than it has been in the past. So, you know, in your experience, what's the role, I guess, of social media in raising and escalating those concerns? How do you see that trend developing? And given your trade union background, what's the role of trade unions on all of this?
Give me the easiest.
Yeah.
First, I want to say that Sarah Veal's correct. I mean, she always has, and you know, will remain correct on most things, of course. Trade union lawyers are also called Dave, apparently, which probably explains the number of Dear David emails I receive on a daily basis. Looking a bit at the workplace first, and I want to quote Leo Tolstoy in Anna Karenina. Happy families are all alike. Every unhappy family is unhappy in its own way. And I know workplaces aren't necessarily families, but for a workplace to be functional, work well, my experience is that it has to succeed in sort of various key aspects. And this is my shopping list, a very short shopping list, I promise. But information should be shared openly, without secrecy or silo working. And we all know that we work in organisations where that sort of thing might happen. Communication extends to people knowing where to look for information and being alerted to policies, procedures, and how to behave, because we all know that HR will produce another policy that no one's heard of, you know, and say that's been in place for about 5 years. Problems shouldn't fester, and problem people shouldn't be allowed to get away with their behaviour. And discarding the family analogy, managers are not parents. They shouldn't be viewed as parents, and they shouldn't be expected to parent staff. A nurturing manager will have a role in assisting their colleague, a member of staff, to grow and achieve. But people should behave and be treated like grown-ups. They shouldn't be allowed, and they should be allowed to speak openly without fear of retribution. Coddling staff, and we've seen that, can result in them being institutionalized in a plastic workplace culture. And this is partly because staff are often hired to be created in the image of the person who's hired them. And this can stifle creativity and progress. And for those of you who've read Matthew Said's Rebel Ideas book, which posits that individuals and teams with diverse thinking, a variety of experience, expertise, and opinions are much better equipped to deal with complex issues and problem solve. And the higher levels of collective intelligence allows different ways of problem solving and can offer unique perspectives. And sometimes that's not even allowed when things get fractious. Workplaces have existed where the core who are central to their function are allowed to do whatever they want. And those in the periphery are interchangeable and they're dispensable. And change is difficult to come by in such organisations. So the ability to criticise and the ability to raise concern should be welcomed without the defensive barriers coming up, as Sean said earlier, with a chance to learn from mistakes. But as Ian Foxley so eloquently described, fear and that blame culture will make it impossible for parties to resolve problems honestly and actually look at problems, because inevitably that defensive barrier will come up, especially with lawyers, all of us, you know, who also, well, you shouldn't say that because just in case, you know, that might be held against you. So there is no opportunity to seek a solution because there is no opportunity to seek it in an honest way. So technology. Typical lawyer answering a question I want to answer. Technology, you know, it has allowed us to work remotely. It's allowed us to convene quickly to try and resolve issues, reduce our carbon footprint, so we're not having to, you know, deal with the trains that have had issues recently. But it is also quite nice to be able to work in a workplace where you can ask questions of each other and try and resolve matters informally without a long email explaining why something is wrong, etc. And also, you know, not all workplaces are office-based. For example, Elle, you know, you were talking about your mum being in the care sector. There are about 2.4 million people working in the care sector, and some of the members we've represented are petrified to go into their workplace because they are bullied, they're discriminated against and harassed, and if they raise any issues, particularly about things like health and safety, they can be punished. And technology, for example, monitoring equipment, can be also seen to be quite intimidating to some, because they're used as a tool to stop people saying what they want to say, or saying, well, you spent 15 minutes with this client, you should have done it in 5. There are issues like that, and where our members raise health and safety concerns, that's our role. We step in and try and assist. But there is a long way to go, I'd say, for technology to completely take over the role of a healthy workplace environment.
That's really interesting. And sticking with the theme of technology, I mean, there are, we've touched on the, throughout the day, I think, on the idea of not just having policies in place and shoving them in a drawer and treating it as a tick box exercise, but actually having a real compliance culture, real speaking up and listening up culture. Do you think there's been a change in the way individuals raise concerns, whether that's kind of a rush to social media or a rush to kind of raise something in a way that they wouldn't have done so before? So, Clive, going back to your point, I guess, around what we might traditionally see as individual HR issues, someone being shouted at, which traditionally might have been raised to a grievance, has there been a trend towards actually raising it in under a whistleblowing policy as a cultural issue? And are people, you know, following their policies, procedures, or are they using different ways to raise those concerns?
Absolutely. We do see where there's a cultural issue in a particular functional community, we will see multiple whistleblowers coming forward talking about the same issue. And after the first whistleblowers made their concern or raised their concern or made their allegation, then the day after we might see another one and another one and another one. And that's useful because that gives us corroboration that there's something going wrong. But just going back to how they report and how they raise their concerns, certainly nationwide we have multiple ways in which whistleblowers can raise an allegation, raise a concern. And we're always looking for ways to evolve that, to develop it. IT, certainly for Generation Z, is a big thing. They want the most simplistic way of raising a concern, and they also want it on some form of IT. They want to do it on their phone. So we have tried to evolve our processes. We now have a QR code where whistleblowers can click on a QR code, go straight to the reporting portal and raise their concern. And what they also don't want to do, they don't want to put in big swathes of information about what that concern is about. So we've tried, and we're still evolving now, but we've tried to make it where they are faced with a number of options, drop-down menus, drop-down boxes, where they can report a concern quite quickly in about a minute. And that's what Generation Z want. They want IT, they want simplicity.
And now, you know, you're the voice of Gen Z on this panel. Do you think the way technology has opened up conversations if you're, looking for a job and you're going on Glassdoor or whatever it is that something you think your peers are interested in, and checking out those, what's said on social media about the culture in employer X versus what's said on Glassdoor about employer Y? Is that something that you think your generation is particularly interested in?
Definitely. Like Clive said, Gen Z want to do it quickly, and I think a lot of forums like Glassdoor give you an insight into the culture of a workplace, thus saving you time getting in there, meeting people, and then finding that out yourself. I think it gives you a real insight into what the company's core values are like. And I want to go into law, and a big thing about finding a law firm that's good for you is the culture of the firm. They expect you to know about the culture of the firm, how people work together. So I personally think those forums are quite good. Gen Z definitely like to be able to find that information readily available. Ultimately does save time and considerations that they have to make as well.
Christian, just picking up on some of the points you raised earlier, this behavioural science is just absolutely fascinating. Do you think that there has been a generational shift in terms of Gen Z acting differently than other generations who are still in the workforce, or is it more a case of developments in technology or workplace culture actually affects everyone kind of in the workplace now, regardless of their generation, whereas it wouldn't have had the same effect maybe 5-10 years ago?
So I think we all love to think that we're living in very unique times. These dynamics have always been there. If we think about, I'm not sure what the social equivalent of the Overton window is. The Overton window, for people that know, is the idea that the sort of centre of politics shifts, and we might be able to see that happening at the moment here in the UK. But I think we are impacted by the people that are around us, and I think therefore that impact has always been there. Anyone with kids is influenced by their kids in the same way that we influence our kids, and so we are influenced by other people. I think there is probably a greater opportunity for younger generations to have a voice that they haven't had before. So I think things like social media and Glassdoor, that is capturing conversations, discussions that would have been happening anyway. So I think what we're seeing is technology is turbocharging many of the things that would have been happening. What is interesting is our relationship with technology. And there is something fascinating about the things that we're willing to tell machines that we wouldn't tell other human beings. And so I was doing some research into truth serums back in the 1960s to see how they thought, you don't need that in the 21st century because we all tell Google and social media every single thing that we're thinking. And of course that makes sense, because if you want to maximize your Google search, you might as well tell it the truth. So if you're looking for something strange or quirky, put it in the box. Whereas you might not, if you were going to see the doctor, you might not want to tell them about that embarrassing rash. You'll come in with something else, and then you'll say, oh, by the way, I've also got this rash. Could you just look at that at the same time? And that's the reason you were there. So we're very good at deceiving other people. We're less likely to do that with technology. And I think that's quite interesting from giving people a voice perspective. I think it also, to the point around how we capture information is also helpful. So I think what we are experiencing is nothing and no other, has not happened before, but there are dynamics at play that are very, very different, and the pace of change is different. We are dealing with risks nowadays that the human brain is not capable of managing. The amount of information that we are having thrown at us, and where we're not questioning the source necessarily, and we can see that with the spread of conspiracy theories. So we are definitely, having said that we're like all other generations, there are definitely some different factors there. But I would say, look, the dynamics we're dealing with are broadly similar, but we have to recognise the role that tech is playing in possibly making that happen more quickly than it would do otherwise.
So I'm conscious of time, and we've got some questions. Before we come to the audience, an open question for all of you. Taking into account everything we've said today, do you think Gen Z are more likely to whistleblow than other generations that have gone before them? And if so, why is that?
Shall I answer that?
Go ahead.
The short answer is absolutely yes, because as I said earlier on, they are far less tolerant, I think, of a toxic workplace culture than their millennial or Gen X counterparts. And that, I think that is borne out by a little bit of science and a little bit of research. They don't accept toxic workplaces, and therefore they're more inclined to raise those as concerns. And it's certainly something that we have seen an increase in nationwide.
Shantha, I'm really interested in that. We've focused a lot on kind of toxic workplace cultures and a lot of those kind of behavioural issues. Do you see reports about other things, so, you know, the environment, whatever else it is, has there been a trend towards workplace culture being the subject of these types of reports?
Sorry, reports into...
Whistleblowing reports that are being made at the moment. Has there been a real shift towards actually this is now all about culture, discrimination, harassment, or are people still blowing the whistle about environmental issues or other issues that might be attracting less attention?
Well, I think they are. I think they are trying to bring attention to it, and I think some of the panel members in the previous conversation talked about how difficult it was for people to be interested in perhaps not interested, for them to be able to do anything about things like the Me Too movement, etc. And it's about trying to seek resolution, which is the hardest thing to do, I think. The tribunals, yes, they are still backed up. It is quite difficult to bring a complaint, to model the complaint correctly. Issues around workplace toxicity are around, and I think they will remain. But I think, as Christian said before, you know, it's very important that what is toxic to one person might not be deemed to be toxic to someone else. And I think we really need to understand whether it is someone managing someone else and having a discussion about their performance in a polite way, or is it someone being treated extremely badly? And this idea that both those things have the same gravity is a problem, because then you don't identify what is actually a real problem and what is something that can be resolved with a conversation.
And Fraser, I think you've touched on that before, that issue around actually what might be offensive or difficult for one set of people might actually just be kind of entirely normal, just seen as management by another group. How do you kind of deal with that, or think employers should deal with that?
Oh, I mean, that's incredibly difficult. But I think some upfront conversations, I think bringing out those conversations courageously can be incredibly valuable in doing that, and working out quite where your parameters are, but also recognising that needs to be an agile conversation. These things aren't static. I just did want to reel back to your question around sort of Gen Z and whether they're more likely to raise concerns. And I think at a general level, yes. But I think let's not fall into that dangerous trap of creating a generational stereotype. Right across every generation, there are people that feel comfortable and people that don't. Let's not say, oh, brilliant. Gen Z have got it sorted. We don't need to worry. There plenty of Gen Z will be left behind. Plenty of Gen Z will be on the wrong side of power imbalances, will not have the psychological safety in their particular workplace or context or environment, will not have the right systems and processes, will not have the culture that encourages people to talk through. Let's not let's not leave those people behind on the basis that, on the whole, everyone's more likely to. And so let's not be lazy and say, well, Gen Z have got it sorted. We actually need to make sure that we still have those systems, those processes, that we're sparking the conversations, that we're getting the culture, that we're humanising it, that we're making it normal to talk about these things. And that's the only way through it.
I think that's also right, because Gen Z has allowed Gen X, is that what we are? I don't know. Whatever we are, to speak up about things, because when we trained, etc., you did what your partner told you to do. You didn't question that he was lighting a cigarette up at 5 p.m. because he could, and even though nobody else wanted smoke in the room. Those were the sorts of things that you couldn't question. And if you were shouted at, you couldn't question it. And now the conversation is happening, and it's very positive. There is a balance to be had, as with all things, but it's positive.
Thank you very much. I'm conscious of time, so I just wanted to open it up to the audience in case anyone had any thoughts, comments or questions for the panel. We'll start there.
Hi, I just wanted to get the panel's views, sort of picking up on something that Fraser said in particular. Sorry, no pressure. The point you sort of made about the importance of creating a culture where you can have those open conversations early on to hopefully avoid getting to the level where you need to go down that formal whistleblowing route. I just would be interested to hear any of your views on, one, kind of how to achieve that, and two, more generally, how to sort of ensure that you are you're taking people's concerns seriously, but where appropriate, you are guiding them to those internal policies and procedures that might better deal with their complaint without obviously kind of shutting down their concerns. So making people feel that you're taking their concerns into account and creating that speak up culture, but kind of guiding their concerns to the right process where necessary.
Okay, so I can only speak for Nationwide. We have a high anonymity rate, a relatively high anonymity rate, about 57 to 58%. Most people who report to us do so anonymously, and they do so because they don't want to have those difficult conversations with their manager or their manager's manager. They want us to do that on their behalf. They want the investigation to identify if there is any wrongdoing. So where individuals do identify themselves to us and it is about a personal grievance where they can resolve it themselves, we will discuss it with them, we will channel them to their manager, or we will channel them to HR. But clearly, if they are raising it anonymously or they're raising it in complete confidence where they don't want to be identified, that's a really tricky and difficult conversation to have because they want to remain either anonymous or they want to be dealt with confidentially.
Well, one quick thing I'd add is that one of the things that we often do is focus heavily on whistleblowing and ignore the fact that every single day there are small things that people come forward with, they report things. If we don't take small things seriously, then people are going to think, well, they're not even listening to that, they're listening to the big things. So I think when we think about it's this big thing. You know, I'm not a big fan of the term because I think it creates this stress in people. It sounds like a big, heavy process. We should also be listening to people on a day-to-day basis. And so I think when people report small things, inconsequential things that they make an effort to report, if we don't respond to that, we ignore it, we rubbish it, then they're probably not going to come forward to the bigger stuff. And I think it's really important to, again, think about the user experience, if you want to use sort of customer terminology, and think about what does it feel like. And so if people feel listened to on the small stuff, they're more likely to come on the big stuff. If they feel ignored on the small stuff, there's probably even less chance of doing anything. And that's, you know, that's how we avoid escalation. People don't go straight to divorce lawyers. They tend to have a discussion amongst themselves and build up to that stage. We want to try and avoid that. So those small things are really important.
And I think for that you need a culture of openness and people who will actually listen to you. It's too easy to sort of, oh gosh, they've come to me with a problem, oh my goodness, you know. But and that has to happen across the piece. It can't be one good sort of manager who sits and listens to everyone whilst everybody else ignores them. So there needs to be some aspect of cultural change within an organisation for there to be that level of openness.
Thank you.
Great. I think we're at time. So just thank you very much to the panel for all of your contributions. Tea and coffee, possibly outside. Oh.
There is going to be tea and buns in a minute. I don't know about the buns, actually. I think I just made them up. But anyway, thanks very much to all the panel and to Linklaters again for hosting us. And I've been told to say it demonstrates that not all corporate lawyers are bad.